Canada, and he will share with us his expertise and experience in testing the walk, evolving from tester to test advocate. Rob is the principal consultant of amibug.com, having accumulated more than 25 years of management experience leading teams of software development professionals, and he has managed, trained, mentored, and coached hundreds of top professionals in the field. Please welcome Rob Sabarin. Rob Sab.
Wow, the technology. How's everyone doing this morning? You're okay? You're quiet? Right? So I'm very, very happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me, and it's so far been a wonderful conference, a busy day yesterday for me, and today is promising to be equally busy. The talk that I'm giving today is something that was inspired by another talk that I attended. It was a talk that was given by someone by the name of James Whittaker. Anyone ever hear of James Whittaker? Wrote many books about testing. He speaks about the subjects an awful lot. And he made a speech in 2012 at the very famous American Star West conference. And he suggested some pretty dramatic stuff. He suggested, for example, that testing is getting in the way of quality. This was meant maybe to be controversial, but he also suggested that within 3 years, if things don't change, most testers will be out of work or out of the type of work that they know. He suggested, his advice was, get into a very specialized niche like performance, security, or privacy testing, or learn to code. When I heard this, I said, gee, that's inconsistent with my vision. That's inconsistent with my experience. And maybe there's another path. Maybe there's something else we can consider doing. And so I sort of said, well, maybe there's a third alternative, and that's what I call test advocacy. And so I designed this talk in sort of a response to James Whittaker to sort of present an image which is wonderful, beautiful, and, if you will, not a perfect path, but a walk for us. So I want to test the walk with my tester's walk with you. So this is about test advocacy. The beginning of test advocacy is something that changes your role in thinking about what you do as a tester in an organization. It fits in nice with the discussion we just had about Eric's ideas of excellence and demonstrating examples and setting things up. The test advocate that I'm thinking of is a role that will influence change, and someone whose advice and wisdom is sought out and really contributes and makes a difference. And it's not a fictitious role. I spent last week about a day and a half with a young lady in Madison, Wisconsin, in the United States of America, who actually has created a role almost exactly like the one I'm going to describe to you today. And the more I meet people in different organizations, I see more and more people taking on these type of roles of test advocacy. So anyhow, let's have some fun with this and talk a little bit about what it means to be a test advocate. So the first thing the test advocate does, or I do as a test advocate, is I try to understand what is quality. And I stop trying to impose my personal view of quality. The point of this for me is not to say, hey, quality is A, or quality is B, or quality is C. But instead, I want to learn what quality is to people who are the stakeholders on my project, people who influence or are influenced by the result of our work. And stakeholders themselves are things that I have to discover. I don't even know who a stakeholder is. For me, a stakeholder sometimes is someone who I trip over when I walk down the hall. Or it's someone who's blocking me from succeeding. Someone who's stopping me. And I look at them. I used to be frustrated. I used to be angry. I used to be mad. Hey, the accounting department is blocking my testing project. This is awful. This is terrible. And then I started saying, wait a sec. I've just discovered a stakeholder. Right? And I want to find out what they care about. What is quality? What is quality to them? Not as what is Rob Sabarin's definition of quality, but what is quality to my stakeholders? And then can I serve that? Or maybe I can't. But if I find inconsistencies, it's wonderful. And if I find multiple stakeholders with different visions of quality, this is for me the most glorious bug I've ever found in my life. Because I've got two stakeholders pulling us in different directions. And if I can reconcile that before we waste all our time and money and energy on the project, well, maybe I can make the world a teeny-weeny bit of a better place. Maybe we can get things done more smoothly. Quality can be many different things. I did an informal survey among my customers, found 15 different definitions of quality. Some are dramatically different. I boiled it down to my personal group of 3 types of definitions of quality. And, I'm not talking about dictionary definitions. I'm really talking about what is used when people make quality-related decisions. The first one is a nice old one, conformance. Anyone use that? Quality is conformance to requirements. Some people like that. It's a historical one. And when I find stakeholders who value that, then I find what I have to advocate is conformance to both explicit and implicit requirements. And as I'm always telling people, I find the implicit requirements oozing out the walls of the building. They outnumber the explicit ones by a huge factor. And they're the requirements that suggest that everything we ever did has to work with everything we're ever going to do. And that's just how it is. So, explicit requirements and implied. So if conformance matters, I've got to look a lot at implied stuff. Sometimes our stakeholders feel quality has more to do with purpose. Quality could be suitability to purpose. I don't know if you've ever heard that definition. That dates back to Joseph Joran in the 1930s. Quality is suitability to purpose. And if that's the case, and if that's what matters, then what we do is we care not what the system does for the user, but what the user does with the system. Can the user do their job with the system under test? And we're advocating now a position of who are the users and what do they do? And what can they do? And what is good enough in that space? And it's a totally different worldview of quality. And the last one that I see in the class of definitions is value. Now, quality is value to stakeholders. And that's a big one. And that's maybe too general. But I see a lot of that. That's Jerry Weinberg style stuff or Tom Gilb style stuff. It's interesting because if that's the case, then what I've got to do is hunt around and find out who are the stakeholders and what do they value. And that becomes my job, if you will, to learn that. And it's not like I'm going to tell you make a template and give a checklist and send an email and ask people to fill in a form to vote on what their definition of quality is. Very often you have to watch what people do. Watch and observe the type of decisions they make over time to start understanding what quality is. Very few executive stakeholders that I've ever met can tell me in words what quality is, but they certainly can in action. And so the test advocate has to learn by observing the decision-making of the stakeholders, not just by listening to the rhetoric and God bless the written policy. I hope it comes from observing what's reality. So that's the beginning for the test advocate, is what is quality. When you look at value, there's different types of values, and I think we've got to be very sensitive to all of these. Physical value, that is gold, money, stuff that we praise or treasure. There's emotional value, that's that feeling of well-being, and there's a lot of this kumbaya, we feel good about being on the team, and yay company sort of stuff going on in the world. But I think that emotional stuff is very critical, not just in our teams, but also in the way people use our product. I want people not just to use the software, but to be happy using the software. I want them to be engaged and enjoy using the products, not just be satisfied with the requirements of the project. And then there's ethical values. Are the values ethically consistent with what we're trying to do? And the whole universe of ethics is a big, broad thing that more and more organizations I start seeing are concerned about the ethical nature of what we're doing. And so is what we're doing consistent with the ethics or the ethical framework of our organization? The next thing I like to look at when I'm advocating testing is what exactly is testing. And I'm not sure anymore. I do detailed task analysis. I watch people test. I observe it, I record it, I transcribe it, I study it deeply. And I find there's a huge, rich variety of skill ideas out there that people brand as testing. There's a lot of different stuff. There's more than my little list of 3 here. Some is confirmatory, confirming, so we're checking, confirming. Does the system do what it's supposed to do? That sort of stuff. Some is exploratory. where you basically don't really know what it's supposed to do in advance. You learn it and test it on the fly. And learning is, I think, for me, what the biggest definition of testing would be: to learn about something. Learn. I come out with knowledge, and I try to share that knowledge, and I try to use the application or study the application to learn it. If you will, studying and learning are fit together in what is testing. And I'm not really sure what testing should be, but I know that that word testing is really loaded a lot. It's really loaded. So you might want to consider looking at what are the skill sets that make up testing, and how can you help people develop those or make sure those exist on different projects. Of course, the test advocate has to play with the notion of the bug. I'm a big fan of bugs. I don't know if you guys know, I wrote a little teeny book for children about bugs. And what is a bug is something I think that we have to learn from our organization. I don't want to get into a debate about it. It could be something related to defective software. It could be a failing, including inaccuracy, including omission. Something that's not there that should be there, or that could be there, or that someone would rather be there. These are failings. And broadly, the biggest picture for me is that a bug relates to something we're concerned about. What are our stakeholders? What are our users? What are they concerned about? And as a test advocate, I want to make sure that on our projects, we're sensitive to the concerns of our stakeholders and our user community. And so this becomes now, what is a bug for me? It's something related to the concerns. It's not maybe a perfect definition, but it's something that if I know what the concerns are, then I can sort of say, hey, can I find these concerns? Can I identify them? Can I mitigate them? Can I know which ones we're not sure of and which ones we are sure of, and all that type of stuff. So this is the what is a bug side of things. We have the notion of what's the point. You ever wonder, why are we doing it? What's the purpose of testing? Why test? Should we be testing? Shouldn't we do something else? I want to talk to you about an example that I was exposed to last fall when I was at a major American social networking company in Mountain View that's very, very popular, and you probably are all members of them. I won't name them, except I'll say that they have something to do with books and faces. When working with them, I looked at their testing strategy on some projects, and I said, wow, that's pretty interesting. What did you do? Well, we basically deployed the product in New Zealand and watched them for 30 days. We watched New Zealand use the software for 30 days. We fixed the problems and then deployed it to the rest of the world. Isn't that a good way to test? Wouldn't you all like to do that? Take your software, deploy it in New Zealand for 30 days, and then go back and this is checking. This is checking. Not all of us have that sort of resources, but holy cow, there's different ways to look at this whole testing paradigm. I asked the question, why check? What are we going to learn? How is that going to add value? Is it or not? Is checking going to help me give regression confidence to my stakeholders? Is checking going to give me a warm, fuzzy feeling in my tummy that makes me feel very good, that I can ship this software with confidence and without fear? Is that why I'm checking? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Why should I think? Shouldn't I mechanize my testing so that it's robotic and just mechanical? Or maybe I know that I can't model software, or I can't model use of software, I can't model operations, and cognitive processes are ways to sort of ferret out interesting problems or concerns. And then why bother? This is, of course, the New Zealand thing. Why not just let the user find the problems that matter and deploy them? Apple came out with a product. I'm sure you've all heard of it. It was the iPhone 4. Anyone have an iPhone 4? If you have one, just leave it at the front of the room for me, again, because I'm a teacher and you're supposed to give me an Apple. The iPhone 4, when it was released in the United States of America, had a little bug. You couldn't do voice telecommunications on the world's biggest phone network. It was interesting and it was ironic that you couldn't do voice phone calls on the AAA 3G network. And they fixed it with an antenna fix and a patch. But the point is, it didn't matter. Why bother? Who cares? We're selling this thing to early adopters and innovators who want to use it for the 4G digital side of things and not the 3G analog side of things. And it was basically a good example of a context where it didn't matter. Regression, confidence, and voice communications on the telephone didn't matter. And I'm just watching Graham Bell turn in his grave, right? It was awesome. But I think that we have to know when we're talking about testing, why we're testing. And I believe purposeful testing is critical. I think on time, on budget, and on quality are meaningless unless you're on purpose. Is your work fulfilling a purpose? The notion of test advocacy, I guess, is something that's an evolution in testing. And I'd like to just go through a little timeline of the view of testing. I know there's probably very few people who were around at the time. I wasn't there. I was born in 1960. But in the mid-1950s, this was the beginning of the notion of software testing. And it started off probably documented around 1957. And that was basically referenced in the book by McCracken, Digital Computer Programming. And he made an appendix of the book. And he morphed a whole bunch of concepts. He talked about at least three things. He talked about troubleshooting, he talked about debugging, and he talked about fixing. So troubleshooting, debugging, fixing, all of that. And he's in his chapter, the appendix on it, was called code checking, which is not the definition that some people advocate for checking, but that's what they called it. That's the first time someone sort of thought that through. Now think at the time what programming was like. It took, the capital cost of computers was outrageous. It took huge teams of people to assemble things and get things going. And there was just no notion of roles and responsibilities. Even what is a programmer wasn't a clear role. But that's where we started. We started with that heavy metal stuff in the 1950s. And then we advanced a little bit. And by the way, you'll notice the car artwork here. This is, what car do you think this is? 67. Americana. Mustang, right? No? Never heard of Mustang? No. Too early in the morning for that, I guess. Anyhow, this is basically the 1967 era, and people started to say, aha, we're now into mainframes, we're starting to realize teams of people can develop software together, we're starting to understand, for example, that programming has fundamentals. So Weinberg writes a book on fundamentals, Donald Knuth starts putting together the art of computer programming. We're starting to see there's systematic ways to practice the craft that can be taught to people, not just rocket scientists. And this was a good start, except it was weird models. Royce actually started writing about waterfalls about 2 years after this. And so we're in this era where basically testing is not really there yet, but people are starting to say programming has skills. And there's skills we can teach. And some people have got to double check things maybe, but there's sort of skills. So it's the beginning of that. By 1979, by the way, that's an AMC Gremlin if you're a car person. In 1979, we started having serious views of what are the skills in software testing. Glenford Mayer wrote a book about software testing. We had different things like testing teams that were set up. It was the very beginning of it, but it was dangerous too. AT&T did crazy things in the States and Canada where they hired everyone with a technical degree, and they basically divided them in two groups, the people who could program and the people who couldn't. And the people who couldn't program became testers. And this is where the big myth of testers or failed programmers started. It was actually something that was going on because the equity was to own the people who, or have the resources in your team who had the technical skills. So they didn't want to fire them, so they had them test software. It was a flaky notion, but this eventually evolved to, in about the period of 1985, where we started to say, aha, the total quality movement kicked in. You ever hear of, for example, Phil Crosby or Ken Kainer? All these people started, or Boris Beiser even in the era. They started to take a look at things and they said, maybe we should have a wall between testing and programming. And maybe what we should do is basically separate them so that we have objectivity in our testing and we can make sure our software conforms to requirements. Some very important software was developed in this period that changed the world. There was, for example, VMS for DEC-VAX, if you're familiar with that. The code of the HP LaserJet was built with this model. But it was very expensive. And sure, it was interesting and good, but it was very expensive. And this turns around to the modern time, where now we see the application of agile methods. And basically, instead of having testers as distinct or separate roles, we see now testers collaborating again with the developer. So what we have then in this circle of where does the tester fit into things is actually, I think, going back to where we started, where today on agile teams, people are saying, well, there shouldn't be an independent role of testers. Testing is a skill set, and everyone on the team should have some skills in different areas, and you don't have to wait for Fred the tester. Anyone with sufficient testing skills can do a testing activity. And this is sort of a cool thing where you basically say, gee, that's where we started. Except at the beginning, we didn't know what the skills were, and now we know a lot more about the skills. I think we still have work to do, how to teach them, and how to describe them, and how to identify them, but at least we know that that's sort of how it seems to work. And a lot of agile teams that I see fail because they still keep the separate roles. They have separate testers from the programmers, and basically, because of that, they get all sorts of weird siloing effects in Sprint. It takes years to evolve, though. It takes years to get there. I see still notions of large system testing verification teams. I saw this picture is actually artwork based on a real one that I saw in South America, where you had a room about this size, all full of testers working like in some sort of movie set. And it was like all exactly the same, like check, 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 check. Tons and tons and tons of verification going on, and everybody's sort of moving in the same direction. Whereas in agile teams, we see maybe 10 people, and they're all working very tightly with each other to try to get the job done. Now, both of them are valid ways to develop software. Both of them are legitimate. The key thing for the test advocate is the test advocate has got to realize that the punishment has got to fit the crime. The punishment has got to fit the crime. We should choose the life cycle model that solves the problem. Don't just do agile for the sake of agile. Don't just do structured or engineered or waterfall for the sake of waterfall. Choose an SDLC that solves the business and technical problems of your organization. And if it's a hybrid approach, well, work with people who know about hybrid approaches and get the job done. So it's basically, for me, it's a question of the punishment fits the crime. Today, we see people who are taking the role of a tester and suggesting that the tester should be flexible. How many people are told by their bosses, hey, you should be a flexible tester, we're going to be agile, be more flexible. And really what they mean is you should become a contortionist. You should try to say, hey, squeeze 8 months of testing into 3 weeks and do it in an afternoon. And you can imagine someone squeezing themselves into a teeny-weeny little box in something like a contortionist. And this is what people suggest is agile testing. And I look and I say, well, what the test advocate's role is to take that around, break it into a skill type of discussion, and then look at ways to gracefully do the job. I live in Montreal, Canada. About 100 kilometers north of where I live is the Laurentian Mountains. Please come visit in October. In the fall, the leaves have fallen, the mountains are beautiful, and the air is crisp. You can stand there, just stand in the woods, and listen, not a sound. And all of a sudden, you hear a whoosh sound. And if you look and your eyes follow the whoosh sound, what you're going to see is the tail of a beautiful, beautiful deer. And I'm not saying that looking up close at the tail of a deer is interesting, but far away it's beautiful. And when you look at that, look at the path the deer just ran through. It was full of rocks and crevices and branches and leaves and all sorts of obstacles. And what that deer did was gracefully navigated a complex path of obstacles to get by without hardly making a sound. That's grace. That's agility. That's what I mean when I talk about agility in testing, finding graceful ways to collaborate with people to do the job. So the test advocate, in my view, is frankly the person who's got to sort of figure this out, figure how to turn this from a cooker type of problem, a pressure cooker, contortionist testing problem, into a graceful testing problem. And if you want a practical piece of advice on that, one of the things I think that we can do is actively engage, as testing professionals, actively engage in the planning of the work in the sprint, including the programming, the data stuff, documentation, all the planning, and make sure that we break down the testing into a set of tasks that can be done not just by you, but by other suitably skilled people in the team. I think that gives you a much more graceful basis. So how do you learn how to do that type of thing, to make that sort of transition? Well, one of the things that I like to suggest is that the test advocate should have a strong basis in philosophy. And maybe you might think this is hilarious to say Rob is telling you to learn philosophy, but I am definitely going to start with Socrates. Ever hear of Socrates? You guys aren't with me here. Socrates, ancient Greek philosopher? Yes? Yes, Rob? Yeah? Heard him? All right. Well, Plato wrote a lot about Socrates. And Socrates basically suggested that the unexamined life is not worth living. That was a very important philosophical thing from Socrates. And I want to take that and I want to look at testing. And I want to say the unexamined project is not worth running. I want to take my projects, I want to do retrospectives, I want to look at them, and I want to examine what I did frequently, and I want to apply incremental change. Not always improvements, but I try to make improvements. But that's Socratic. That goes back over 2,000 years in philosophy. The philosophies that I want my test advocates to master, the work of Dijkstra. Dijkstra, who in the 1960s showed us that testing is intractable, that testing can demonstrate the presence of bugs, but never demonstrate the absence of bugs. To show you can test forever, basically, and not have complete coverage. That's Dijkstra. Steve Covey and his wonderful work on the 7 Habits of Effective People. Begin with the end in mind. Understand the goal. Understand how important the goal is before you try to solve the problem. Begin with the end in mind. Then there's the work of Ken Keener. And this is a philosophy of testing thing, where he said that the best way to look at the effectiveness of a tester is to see if the bugs they find are getting fixed. It's not just finding bugs, it's finding bugs and influencing change. There's Parkinson's law from the 1950s. Work expands to fit the time allocated to do it. There's all sorts of work from Weinberg and McGill about requirements and about value and about general systems thinking. Joseph Juran, who taught us about the 80-20 rule in engineering and suitability to purpose. Deming, who taught us plan, do, check, act. These are philosophies. And if you have a good understanding, not just of the words of these philosophers, but of the practical application of them, and breaking it into your work, then you can apply some of these things and your own to your own projects. And I'm not just saying metaphors. I mean, really, these are truths. What are the truths? And can we apply them? So if you don't know them, how can you apply them? So you might implicitly know them. I say, why not study and learn them? So this is my philosophy rant. I believe it is very important for the test advocate to be thorough and to apply rigor in reviewing things. And although the book in this picture looks like an old IEEE 830 style requirement document, I'm not saying that everything should be paperwork. What I am saying is that we should look and hunt for insights of information and value in all sorts of places, and to review things, to learn, and to find cool ideas. Maybe we'll discover something of importance that will give us a test idea that can help the team learn more with less work, or know what matters. And so this is the rigorous reviewing. I think the test advocate has to become very well schooled in reviewing, and not just reviewing for business purposes, reviewing for technical purposes. And sometimes reviewing involves elicitation. It's not just reading documentations, it's basically elicitation. I've done some interesting work recently where I have basically videos and audio tapes of stakeholders explaining to developers what they want features to do. And if you watch that, review those carefully, you start seeing where ambiguities get in things, because people don't ask questions, or people have biases and they think they knew the answer. And so once they confirm their bias, they stop asking questions. So this is something that we can get by reviewing. I think reviewing many things and then pondering, taking the time to let it sink in. This is not a critique of any one course, but I do a lot of training, and when I'm asked to do a half-a-day course on unit testing, I suggest, well, it might take a few months for even that to sink in, Let things sink in. And not just one thing, but many things. And then start doing stuff which we would call an affinity analysis. An affinity analysis is something that I learned about from the American TV show Sesame Street. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of Sesame Street. Yeah? This is not popular in Malaysia? No? I know it's popular in Riyadh, but I don't know Malaysia. So in Sesame Street, what happens is children learn to basically compare things. And they play a game called One of These Things is Not Like the Other. They're given 4 objects, and they're actually asked what's the same and what's different. And they do an affinity analysis. It's an amazing thing. What I want to do is when I've done all this reviewing and done all this learning, then I want to compare and contrast multiple things. I don't want to just go to say, here's the best way to test it. Here's 4 or 5 different ways to test it. What's the benefit and consequence of doing and not doing all of these things? Review multiple things together. You may not choose any one of those things, but you'll probably synthesize an excellent answer. And I think the test advocate should be prepared to do that. So look at multiple alternatives and learn about them. I like the test advocate to take a step forward, not just a step back. So learning is a step back. But I also want you to recommend things. In fact, I'd like you to always know what you would like to do next. If I had only one more thing to test, what would it be? If I had to ship a build today, which build would it be? What would you recommend? And if there's multiple things, well, what's the trade-offs? Help guide the business decision. Don't be afraid. The test advocate should be able to step forward. A lot of people tell me, when I talk about test advocacy, let's do a process change, let's go for some low-hanging fruit. I say no, to heck with low-hanging fruit. I'm finished with low-hanging fruit. I'm going to take the hard-to-get fruit that's meaningful and delicious. I want to do hard things well to make an effective change. I don't just want to do easy things here. So I want testers to be able to, the test advocate to be able to recommend things, what bugs to fix, what bugs not to fix. I don't say you have the final decision here. You're not the owner of the company. I'm not suggesting that. But I am suggesting that you should not just present information objectively, but also have something like a recommendation in there. And that means that you might need to develop some skills in rhetoric. Rhetoric and rhetorical analysis is a skill set that you can learn. It's not a traditional technical skill. It's a traditional argumentation skill. It used to be taught at university level as a subject by itself. But now you see it as part of, I think, language arts departments mostly. I think we should be able to plead for bugs. I think we should be able to advocate bugs like the way Kem Kainer teaches in his black box testing courses. The question is, can we provide a compelling argument? Can we provide a compelling argument for a course of action? And learning argumentation, I think, is an incredibly important skill for the test advocate to use and apply. But it's not just for bugs that I want things to go. I want to actually advocate testing. And I started this last summer. It's 2 years now. I'm developing new ways to teach test design. And in these test design approaches, what we do is we use a Lego robot. That's a Lego robot that looks for a line on a paper. And I get groups of people to design test patterns on flip chart sheets, beautiful test patterns using systematic test design approaches. And then what I ask each group to do is to advocate the test. So don't run the test, advocate the test. What would I learn if the test passed? What would I learn if the test failed? Why should I use your test instead of someone else's test? And suddenly, it's not just applying the skill in test design, but it's creating the compelling argument to run the test. When we only have time to run one test, what is the next one to run? And so this becomes advocating testing. Now you've got to realize that advocating testing is cultural, and there's business and technical cultural differences. I just want to show you a few pictures to illustrate this. For example, in the United Kingdom, advocates probably wear wigs. So you see the wigs. In Canada, they don't wear the wig. So you see the wig? No wig. And in the States, you'll see that, they wear a suit with a tie. In Canada, no suit with a tie. So there's cultural variance on how we advocate things. That's a little humor. You don't go for the humor. Okay. It works in some countries. It doesn't work everywhere. The test advocate, it's not just the hard skills, it's the soft skills. I like to suggest that the test advocate is paid not just for their objectivity, but for their subjective assessment and their sensitivity. I want the test advocate to be sensitive to the customers, to the team, to the values of people, and also to why one person might think this is the best thing and another think it's the worst thing. Be sensitive. One of the coolest things I've seen recently is test reporting where the tester is asked to provide their subjective assessment of the state of the product if we shipped it today. And they present it as a top 10 list. Here's a top 10 things critics would say if I shipped the product today as a subjective assessment. And in an organization, maybe 200 people who get this information, they get this whole detailed report, they get metrics, they get graphs, they get all sorts of stuff. But what everybody reads is that top 10 list. And it's really cool because it's influencing change and it's being very sensitive. I love that stuff. Subjective assessment. I think the test advocate should develop coaching skills. And that would mean to work with people. And the key thing for coaching is to let people fail safely. So when we're introducing change, how do we let people fail safely? And I've met people who call them so-called agile coaches, and they go and they coach people into all this so cool self-organizing teams, and they self-organize them into some sort of version of hell that would sound terrible to live in. I think a coach has got to really let people break problems down into small chunks, try things different, fail safely, and build on the experiences. So coaching is not the same as, if you will, mentoring. It's with specific goals, and I think the test advocate should develop skills like that. Eventually, I feel the test advocate will become a trusted teacher. And that's why you look at the picture, there's the apple in front. You could tell they trust the teacher because they give them the apple. It is not a poisoned apple. Now, teaching involves incredible skills that are not natural for people. Pedagogy, how we organize knowledge, how we organize teaching things is hard. And I think those are important skills that the tester can apply. If they learn great technical skills and some teaching skills, they can become superstar advocates, and people will come to them and treat them as sage advisors. A sage advisor. That means your stakeholder will come to you and seek your counsel about product issues, about quality issues, about support issues, about cost issues, about risk issues. So I think the test advocate eventually becomes the sage advisor. But be cautious. The king never makes a mistake, but the king will often chop off the head of the advisor if they give them weak advice. So being a sage advisor has risks and benefits. We'll also, why not play the service model? The test advocate can test drive things. They can basically take things to the next level, try things out, move things to the point. So we can actually test things, right? We can test things. The word test drive, by the way, entered the English language in about 1957, just to let you know that that's the era of the word. The test advocate should have consistent values. Values, are not just something for the friends and neighbors at home, but they're also things for the team and company at work. And where do these values come from and what are they is an important thing. How do the values move from project to project, from team to team, is a critical thing. And I look at values in at least 3 areas, but business, technical, organizational, and the fourth, cultural, which is very hard for me to work on. But there's a lot to be said about being sort of a custodian of values. And so that's, I think, an important thing for the test advocate to do. Maybe when things are bad and the world is in a hard time, we can do things like have one of these test aid conferences. We can get like all the great rock bands to sing songs together and raise money for testing. And a test advocate can set that up. Why not, eh? Why not do that? I think that there's maybe something in there. But why am I saying this? Do you think that makes sense? There's these great people who are raising money for the poor and all that stuff. What am I saying, raising money for testing? Well, the reason I'm saying that is because I believe that the test advocate is painfully aware of the fact that testing is about social responsibility. Software testing is about social responsibility. Today, all of us in this room, depend on software or know people who depend on software to live. We all have hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of apps available at our fingertips to do all sorts of stuff that are being whipped off by kids on weekends, by the way, some of them. People depend on software more than ever. And I like to say that the test advocate realizes that, and realizes that part of their role in testing is to become part of that social safety net, to protect the public, to protect the interests of people. And this is for me an important message about test advocacy, is to remember that testing is not just about you and about bugs, but it's increasingly about social responsibility. We talked already about ethics and judging things, and at least making stakeholders aware of the issues of it so that we can basically offer wise counsel and help people get things done. Anyhow, I'm going to end there. I'm happy to have had the opportunity to chat with you this morning. I'm going to be around for the next couple of days, and I hope we can continue the dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Rob Savarin for that great presentation, and thank you for framing the issues with so much clarity.